1 month after I walked my only daughter down the aisle, her wedding photographer called me in a panic. "Sir," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I noticed something terrible in the background of the reception photos. Come to my studio immediately, and whatever you do, do not tell your daughter." When I saw what my brand new son-in-law was handing to the catering manager in the shadows of the banquet hall, my blood ran cold. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the truth always comes to light, no matter how hard someone tries to hide it in the dark. My name is Russell. I am 66 years old, and for the last 10 years since my beloved wife passed away, I have lived a very quiet, very simple life. To my daughter Natalie, and especially to her new husband Cameron. I am just a retired pension-reliant widower who spends his days tending to a modest vegetable garden and reading history books on the porch. I drive a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door. I wear flannel shirts I buy on clearance, and I am always careful to mention how tight my budget is when we go out to dinner. That is exactly what I wanted them to believe. What Cameron did not know, what no one except my oldest friends knew, was that before my supposed retirement, I spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire. I did not rely on a fixed monthly pension. I quietly managed a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. I chose this invisible life to protect my daughter, to ensure she grew up valuing hard work over a trust fund, and to shield us from the exact kind of greedy predators that immense wealth always attracts. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Vince, the highly sought-after commercial photographer that we had hired for Natalie and Cameron's wedding just 4 weeks prior. I answered the phone expecting him to ask for a final shipping address to deliver the bound wedding albums. Instead, his voice was frantic, hushed and tight with anxiety, as if he were afraid someone was listening outside his studio door. "Mr. Russell," Vince said, breathing heavily, "I need you to come to my downtown studio right now. It cannot wait." I frowned, wiping potting soil from my hands with an old rag. I asked him if there was a problem with the payment, or if the photo files had been corrupted. "Sir," he interrupted, his tone completely stripped of its usual professional cheer. "I was doing the final high-resolution edits on the wide-angle shots from the reception. I noticed something in the background. Something terrible. You need to see this with your own eyes. And please, I am begging you, do not say a single word to Natalie or Cameron until you get here." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Vince was a veteran photographer who had shot hundreds of high-profile corporate events and luxury weddings. He was not the type to panic over a spilled drink or an unflattering, candid shot. I grabbed my keys, locked the front door of my modest suburban home, and got into my old sedan. The drive to the city took 40 minutes, but with the rain lashing against my windshield, it felt like 4 hours. My mind raced through a dozen terrible possibilities. Had Cameron been caught in a compromising position with a bridesmaid? Had someone stolen the envelopes of cash from the gift table? I tried to push the anxiety down, relying on the cold, calculating discipline that had made me a successful developer. In business, you do not react to shadows. You wait for the light to expose the facts. I arrived at Vince's studio, a converted industrial loft in the Arts District. He buzzed me in immediately, not even waiting for me to announce myself over the intercom. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, Vince was pacing the hardwood floor in front of a massive glowing desktop monitor. He looked pale, rubbing his hands together nervously. He immediately walked past me, locked the studio door, and pulled down the heavy blackout blinds. "Mr. Russell, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I have been doing this job for 15 years. I edit thousands of photos a month. Usually I blur the backgrounds heavily during post-production to keep the focus entirely on the happy couple. But I took a very wide-angle shot of the ballroom during the first dance to capture the expensive lighting design your daughter wanted. That is when I saw it." He pointed a shaking finger at the screen. It was a beautiful sweeping image of the banquet hall. Natalie and Cameron were in the center, a beautiful blur of motion spinning under the crystal chandelier. But Vince did not look at them. He grabbed his computer mouse and began to zoom in on the far left corner of the image near the heavy velvet drapes that covered the service exit leading to the kitchens. It was a restricted area where no guests were supposed to be. As the image magnified on the massive monitor, the pixels sharpened into a crystal-clear, horrifying tableau. Standing in the shadows partially obscured by the thick curtains was my brand-new son-in-law Cameron. He was not looking at his beautiful bride on the dance floor. He was looking at a woman dressed in the crisp black and white uniform of the catering staff. But this was no ordinary exchange over missing appetizers or schedule changes. Cameron had a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face. In his right hand, he was extending a thick, heavy manila envelope toward the woman. In his left hand, he held a small silver flash drive. The woman was reaching out her fingers, just closing around the drive, her own face set in a cold, calculating expression that did not belong on a hospitality worker. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I asked Vince what I was supposed to be looking at. A covert payment to the staff to keep the bar open late. A secret affair. Vince shook his head, his face grim and tight. Look closer at the envelope, Mr. Russell. Look at what is slipping out of the unsealed flap. He zoomed in even further. Vince used top-of-the-line, ultra-high-definition lenses. The text on the documents inside the envelope was partially exposed, caught perfectly illuminated in the rogue flash of another guest's camera from across the room. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. Printed in bold, undeniable black ink at the top of the crisp white document were the words "irrevocable transfer of assets," and right below that, a name that made the floor completely drop out from underneath me. Russell Properties, LLC, my holding company. The invisible financial fortress I had spent 40 years building to protect my daughter's future. I stood frozen in the dim light of the studio. This was not a careless affair. This was a highly coordinated heist. Cameron, the charming, supposedly successful young man who had swept my daughter off her feet, the man who treated me like a harmless, doddering old fool who could barely balance a checkbook, was standing in the shadows of his own wedding reception, handing over the keys to my corporate empire to a fake catering manager. He had somehow discovered my secret life. He had somehow bypassed my security protocols. He was orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar theft while my daughter danced in her white dress just 50 feet away. I felt a cold, familiar calm wash over me. The kindly pension-reliant widower vanished in that instant. The ruthless commercial developer woke up. I asked Vince to print the highest resolution copy of that section of the photo and put the digital raw file on a secure flash drive. He handed the items to me with trembling hands, asking nervously if I was going to call the police. I told him no. The police would ask questions, and if Cameron knew I was onto him, he would either accelerate his plans or disappear entirely with my daughter's assets. I needed to know exactly who this fake catering manager was, and I needed to know how deep this infection ran before I surgically removed it. I thanked Vince, took the evidence, and walked out into the cold city air. I was not just a retired father anymore. I was a man going to war. I did not go home. I drove straight through the relentless rain toward the financial district. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The image of Cameron standing in the shadows of my daughter's wedding reception burned behind my eyes. He was smiling. That arrogant, smug smile of a thief who thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he was robbing a vulnerable, lonely widower. He had no idea he was picking a fight with a man who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate sharks for a living. But I could not act on raw anger. Anger makes you sloppy. I needed cold, hard facts. I needed to know the identity of the woman in the catering uniform. And more importantly, I needed to know how a 28-year-old supposed marketing executive had bypassed my heavily encrypted corporate firewalls to access the irrevocable transfer of assets document for my holding company. I needed Warren. Warren and I went way back. In the 1980s, when I was building my commercial real estate empire from the ground up. Warren was my forensic accountant. He was a master at following the money-untangling webs of shell companies and exposing corporate fraud. He had retired 5 years ago and lived in a high-security penthouse overlooking the river. I did not call ahead. I knew he would be there. When he opened his heavy oak door, his eyes widened in surprise at my rain-soaked appearance. I did not bother with pleasantries. I stepped inside, handed him my wet coat, and pulled the silver flash drive from my pocket. I told him I needed his specific set of skills immediately. Warren took one look at my face and nodded. He led me into his home office, a room bathed in the blue glow of 4 massive computer monitors. Warren plugged the drive into his encrypted terminal. The high-resolution photograph filled the central screen. The bright, joyful blur of my daughter dancing in her white dress sat in the foreground, a painful contrast to the sinister transaction happening in the dark corner behind her. I pointed to the woman in the black and white catering uniform receiving the manila envelope from Cameron. I told Warren I needed a name. Warren adjusted his glasses and got to work. He isolated the woman's face, enhancing the shadows and sharpening the pixels. She had sharp features, dark eyes, and an expression of cold calculation. Warren ran the enhanced image through a proprietary facial recognition database he still maintained access to from his days of consulting for private intelligence firms. The software churned through thousands of public records, social media profiles, and state registries. The loading bar crawled across the screen. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the computer servers. Then the system pinged. A match appeared on the screen. Her name was Valerie Vance. Warren immediately began pulling up every public record associated with her name. Tax filings, property deeds, vehicle registrations. He typed furiously, his eyes darting across the scrolling lines of data. Suddenly, his hands stopped moving over the keyboard. He leaned closer to the monitor, his face paling. He turned to me and took a deep breath. He told me I needed to sit down. I refused. I demanded to know what he had found. Warren pulled up a scanned state document and enlarged it on the screen. It was a marriage certificate. I stared at the document, my heart plummeting into my stomach. The marriage certificate was dated 4 years ago. The bride was Valerie Vance. The groom was Cameron, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband. I asked Warren if there was a divorce decree, if perhaps this was an old marriage Cameron had simply hidden from us. Warren shook his head slowly. He ran a thorough search of the state and federal divorce registries. There was no dissolution of marriage. The union between Cameron and Valerie was currently active and legally binding. The marriage ceremony I had paid for the beautiful wedding, where I walked my only daughter down the aisle, was a complete and total sham. Cameron had committed bigamy. The sheer audacity of the crime left me breathless. But why? Why go through the elaborate theatrical production of marrying my daughter if it held no legal weight? Warren explained the sinister brilliance of the loophole. By marrying Natalie under false pretenses while keeping his real marriage to Valerie legally intact, Cameron was creating a judicial black hole. It was a highly calculated maneuver designed specifically to bypass state inheritance and marital asset laws. If Natalie were to suddenly pass away, or if my assets were quietly transferred into a joint marital trust, Cameron could funnel the entire fortune directly into his shadow limited liability company with Valerie. Because his marriage to Natalie was legally void, she would have absolutely no legal standing in a divorce court. She could not sue for half the assets because in the eyes of the law, she was never his wife. She was just a victim of fraud left with nothing, while Cameron and his real wife walked away with my life's work. They had used my daughter's pure, trusting heart as a Trojan horse to infiltrate my family and drain my wealth. Cameron played the role of the perfect, devoted fiancé, while his actual wife posed as a catering manager at the wedding to personally collect the stolen corporate documents. It was a level of sociopathic greed that made my blood boil. But the immediate threat was the document slipping out of that envelope in the photo. The irrevocable transfer of assets. Cameron had somehow gained access to my private digital vault. He was preparing to transfer the ownership of Russell Properties into his own shadow accounts. But Warren was not finished. He continued to dig into Cameron's recent digital footprint, scanning public calendar syncs and automated email registries. Warren clicked on a flagged email confirmation that had been routed through a local real estate agency. He read the details aloud, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cameron was not just going after my commercial real estate portfolio. He was coming for the roof over my head. Warren revealed that Cameron had officially scheduled a meeting with a high-end property appraiser for next Tuesday. The address listed on the appraisal appointment was my home, my primary residence, the house where my wife and I had raised Natalie, the house filled with our family memories. Cameron had booked the appraisal under the guise of an estate liquidation preparation. He was accelerating his timeline. He was not going to wait for me to pass away quietly. He was actively preparing to sell the house right out from under me. I stood in the center of Warren's office, feeling the crushing weight of the betrayal. Cameron viewed me as nothing more than a senile, vulnerable old man waiting to be put out to pasture. He thought he could pull the wool over my eyes, strip my daughter of her dignity, and throw me out of my own home without a fight. He thought his plan was flawless. He was incredibly wrong. A fierce, protective rage ignited in my chest. I was going to burn his entire world to the ground. But I could not simply call the police. If I brought the authorities in right now, Cameron would destroy the evidence, and Natalie would be completely devastated, publicly humiliated, and potentially entangled in a massive federal fraud investigation. I needed to be strategic. I needed to let Cameron believe he was still winning. I had to continue playing the role of the weak, forgetful father-in-law while I methodically dismantled his criminal operation from the inside out. I had to sever his access to my accounts, secure my daughter's future, and trap him and Valerie in a corner they could never escape from. I thanked Warren for his help and told him to keep monitoring Cameron's digital activity. I walked out of the high-security building and stepped back into the freezing rain. The storm was raging around me, but my mind was perfectly clear. Cameron wanted to steal my legacy. He was going to learn the hard way why it took me 40 years to build it, and why no one had ever successfully taken it from me. Sunday morning arrived with a bright and cheerful sunlight that felt entirely inappropriate for the grim reality I was carrying. I stood in front of my closet and carefully selected my wardrobe for the mandatory family brunch. I chose a pair of faded corduroy trousers that were slightly too loose and an oversized beige sweater that washed out my complexion. I needed to look like a man whose best days were far behind him. I needed to look like a someone who was quietly fading away. I practiced my posture in the mirror, letting my shoulders slump and allowing a subtle tremor to enter my hands. It was the hardest role I had ever played, but the stakes were higher than any corporate merger I had ever negotiated. I was fighting for my daughter's life. I drove my beat-up sedan to the upscale neighborhood where Natalie and Cameron had recently bought their new home. The house was a sprawling, modern craftsman, immaculate, and entirely out of place for a young couple supposedly living on a junior executive salary. As I parked on the pristine driveway, a heavy wave of sorrow crashed over me. My beautiful, innocent daughter believed she was building a future inside those walls. She had no idea the foundation of her marriage was a criminal syndicate designed to strip her bare. I took a deep breath, buried the ruthless corporate titan deep inside, and pulled the mask of the fragile old widower firmly into place. Natalie opened the front door before I even reached the porch. She threw her arms around me, her face glowing with genuine joy. The scent of her floral perfume and the warmth of her embrace almost broke my resolve. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to drop the act, hold her tight, and tell her we needed to leave this poisoned house immediately. Instead, I patted her back with a shaky hand and offered a weak, trembling smile. I told her the house smelled wonderful, complimenting the aroma of baked goods and roasted coffee wafting from the kitchen. She beamed with pride, taking my arm to gently guide me into the dining room. Cameron was standing by the kitchen island adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. When he saw me, his lips curled into a wide, predatory smile that made my stomach churn. He walked over and patted me on the back with just a little too much force, the kind of aggressive physical contact designed to establish dominance. He asked how the drive was, speaking uncomfortably loud and enunciating every single syllable as if I were entirely deaf or struggling to comprehend basic English. I blinked slowly, putting on a confused expression, and answered in a quiet, raspy voice that traffic was a bit confusing, but I managed to find my way. We sat down at the elegant dining table surrounded by expensive crystal and imported linen. Cameron immediately took control of the hosting duties. While he poured a rich, dark roast coffee for himself and Natalie, he reached for a different pot and poured a weak, watery liquid into my mug. He leaned across the table, speaking in that same loud, slow voice, and announced he had made special decaf just for me because he knew how jittery my heart gets at my age. He gave Natalie a look of mock sympathy, playing the role of the incredibly caring and attentive husband. Natalie smiled at him, her eyes filled with adoration, completely blind to the condescension dripping from his every word. I swallowed my pride, picked up the mug with both hands to fake a slight tremble, and thanked him for being so incredibly thoughtful. The coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. As the brunch progressed, I played my part flawlessly. I lost my train of thought mid-sentence. I asked the same question twice. I deliberately dropped my fork and struggled clumsily to pick it up. Cameron soaked it all in his smug satisfaction, practically radiating across the table. He was convinced I was rapidly deteriorating. When Natalie stepped into the kitchen to check on the pastries, Cameron made his move. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and adopted a tone of deep, artificial concern. He told me that he had been reading the local news recently and was becoming extremely worried about my safety. He slowly explained that my neighborhood was experiencing a surge in crime and that an elderly man living completely alone was an easy target for home invasions. He painted a terrifying picture of vulnerability, trying to scare me into compliance. Then, with the smooth delivery of a seasoned con artist, he offered his solution. He told me I should not have to stress about the upkeep of the house and the bills or the confusing property taxes at my age. He gently suggested that I let him take over the paperwork. He offered to manage the property deeds and tax filings, promising to handle all the complicated legal jargon so I could just relax and enjoy my retirement without any anxiety. The audacity of his proposal was breathtaking. He was sitting in my presence, eating the food my money had likely paid for, calmly asking me to hand over the keys to my entire estate. I looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. I let my jaw slacken slightly, projecting the image of an overwhelmed and exhausted old man who was desperate for relief. I stuttered a bit, telling him that the paperwork had indeed been getting very confusing lately, and that I was finding it hard to keep track of all the due dates. I smiled a weak, grateful smile, and told him I would be so incredibly thankful if he could look at the documents for me. Cameron leaned back in his chair, a look of absolute triumph flashing across his face. He had won. Or at least he thought he had. He promised to come by later in the week to collect the files, assuring me that he would take care of absolutely everything. The sickening feeling of watching him celebrate his perceived victory was suffocating. I needed to get away from the table before my disgust cracked my fragile facade. I excused myself, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape, and asked Natalie for the direction to the guest restroom. I shuffled slowly down the hallway, leaning heavily on the wall for effect. As I passed Cameron's open home office, I noticed his expensive leather briefcase resting on a low side table near the door. The flap was unbuckled. I stopped in the hallway, listening intently. I could hear Cameron and Natalie laughing in the dining room, their voices muffled by the distance. I took a deep breath, dropped the stooped posture, and moved with silent precision into the office. I approached the briefcase and deliberately dropped my reading glasses onto the rug right beside it. I crouched down to retrieve them, positioning myself to see perfectly inside the unclasped leather bag. Laying right on top of a stack of folders was a printed document. It was not a casual to-do list. It was a highly detailed typed itinerary complete with timelines and contact names. My eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page. Step 1, residential liquidation. Next to it was a date set for just 2 weeks from now. My primary residence was scheduled to be completely liquidated and sold before the end of the month. I kept reading, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Step 2, Natalie's trust. The date next to that was set for the very next day after the house sale. A cold wave of realization crashed over me. The timeline was vastly accelerated. Cameron and his shadow wife were not planning a slow, long con. They were executing a rapid extraction. They intended to strip my assets, drain my daughter's trust fund, and disappear before we even realized we were bleeding. The window I thought I had to surgically dismantle their operation had just violently slammed shut. If I did not act immediately, my daughter would be left entirely destitute and legally tied to a criminal within a matter of days. I committed the dates to memory, picked up my glasses, and slowly stood up. I walked into the restroom, turned on the cold water, and splashed it onto my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The fragile, forgetful old man was gone. The corporate predator I had buried decades ago was fully awake and hungry for blood. I dried my face, pulled my shoulders back, and adjusted my faded sweater. I stepped back out into the hallway, resuming my slow, unsteady shuffle as I walked back to the dining room. Cameron looked up as I entered, still wearing that arrogant, patronizing smile. He asked if I was feeling all right, loudly offering me a glass of water. I smiled back at him, thanking him for his incredible hospitality. I told him I felt absolutely wonderful. And for the first time that entire morning, I was telling the absolute truth. The war was officially on, and Cameron had no idea he was already a dead man walking. I left my daughter's house with the bitter taste of watery decaf coffee still lingering in my mouth. I maintained my stooped posture and slow, shuffling steps until I was securely inside my old sedan and completely out of their line of sight. The moment I turned the corner and left their pristine suburban neighborhood behind me, the fragile old widower persona dissolved entirely. I pressed my foot hard on the accelerator and merged onto the highway, driving directly toward the towering glass and steel canyons of the financial district. A week prior, Cameron had casually handed me a sleek business card for a young, ambitious estate lawyer he claimed was a highly recommended friend of a colleague. He had patronizingly told me this lawyer would give me a generous family discount to update my will and simplify my estate. It was an incredibly obvious trap. Cameron wanted to funnel my entire life's work directly into the hands of a compromised attorney who would eagerly rubber stamp his massive theft. He thought I was an easy, naive mark who would just follow directions. He forgot that to build a highly successful commercial real estate empire in the 1980s, you had to swim with apex predators. And I still knew the most dangerous predator in the water. His name was Fletcher. We had fought side by side in the brutal zoning trenches and ruthless boardroom hostile takeovers 3 decades ago. Fletcher was not a friendly neighborhood family attorney who drafted simple wills. He was a vicious corporate litigator who wore bespoke $1,000 suits and treated the law like a weapon of mass destruction. I parked my battered sedan in the cavernous underground garage of his towering office building. I bypassed the busy front reception desk by using a private executive elevator code I had memorized 20 years ago. The heavy steel doors opened to a sprawling suite of polished marble and dark mahogany. Fletcher was standing behind a massive granite desk, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. When he turned around and saw my faded, oversized sweater and loose corduroy trousers, he did not offer a patronizing smile or a look of pity. He knew exactly what kind of formidable man I was underneath the cheap clearance rack fabric. He took one look at the rigid set of my jaw and the cold fury in my eyes and immediately instructed his assistants over the intercom to hold all his calls and cancel his afternoon appointments. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite him and dropped the silver flash drive containing the high-resolution wedding photograph onto the polished wood of his desk. I told him in a perfectly flat voice that my brand-new son-in-law was attempting a hostile takeover of Russell Properties. Fletcher did not ask me about my feelings. He did not offer any empty sentimental condolences about family betrayal. He simply plugged the drive into his highly secure terminal and meticulously examined the image of Cameron handing over the irrevocable transfer of assets document to his hidden shadow wife in the dark corner of the reception hall. Fletcher leaned close to the glowing screen, his eyes narrowing sharply as he analyzed the visible text slipping out of the manila envelope. He told me that a commercial transfer of that extreme magnitude required multiple layers of state registry filings and authorized holding companies to actually receive the diverted assets legally. If Cameron was preparing to execute the transfer during the upcoming residential liquidation, he had to have already built the hidden financial plumbing to catch the millions of dollars. Fletcher accessed a restricted high-tier legal database, his fingers flying across the keyboard with predatory speed. He completely bypassed the standard public search portals and dug directly into the state's highly secured commercial registration logs. We sat in absolute silence for 10 agonizing minutes. The only sound in the vast office was the sharp, rapid clicking of the computer keys. I watched his face closely. Fletcher was a man who prided himself on rarely showing any emotion, but I saw a tense muscle twitch in his jaw. He stopped typing abruptly and turned the large monitor so I could see the screen clearly. Fletcher had found the trap. It was a shadow company registered under the incredibly generic name Apex Holdings Limited Liability Corporation. It had been officially filed and expedited through the state system exactly 1 week before the wedding ceremony took place. The company was perfectly structured to silently absorb massive commercial real estate portfolios, completely shielding the identities of its managing directors behind thick layers of corporate privacy laws. But Fletcher had the legal clearance and the raw cunning to pierce through those protective layers. He pulled up the founding charter of the shadow company on the screen. Cameron was listed as the primary managing director, establishing his absolute control over the incoming funds, which was exactly as I had expected. But it was the second name on the official state document that made the air completely vanish from my lungs and left me feeling as though I had been physically struck. Listed right below Cameron, with her full legal name and her personal social security number attached as the official co-signer, was my daughter, Natalie. I stared blindly at the glowing screen, my mind struggling violently to process the sheer, unadulterated evil of what I was reading. Cameron had not just forged my corporate documents to steal my wealth. He had stolen his own bride's identity to build the very foundation of his criminal enterprise. Fletcher looked at me with a grim and hardened expression. He explained the terrifying legal reality of our current situation in stark, uncompromising terms. Cameron had deliberately and maliciously intertwined Natalie into the absolute core of the massive fraud. She was legally registered with the state as an active co-conspirator in the multi-million-dollar theft of her own father's estate. If I picked up the phone right now and called the federal authorities or the local police to report the attempted theft of my portfolio, the ensuing criminal investigation would freeze everything immediately. The police would raid their new house, seize all their personal computers, and demand to look at the state registry filings. They would immediately see Natalie's social security number officially authorizing the creation of the shadow company used to execute the theft. Cameron would undoubtedly claim that Natalie was the actual mastermind behind the entire operation, that she had orchestrated the ruthless plot to steal her inheritance early, and that he was just a loving, loyal husband blindly following her explicit orders. Because she was legally married to him and her credentials were on the founding documents, the authorities would absolutely see them as a united criminal front. If I simply attacked Cameron with the blunt force of the law today, my beautiful and completely innocent daughter would be sent to a federal prison alongside him. Cameron had essentially taken his own wife hostage as a human shield against any possible retaliation from me. He knew that if I ever somehow discovered the plot, my hands would be completely tied by my overwhelming love for her and my desperate need to protect her future. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, feeling a cold and dark fury settle deep into the very marrow of my bones. Fletcher poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch and pushed one slowly across the wide desk toward me. He asked me what my exact instructions were moving forward. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I told him we could not simply burn the building down while my daughter was still locked helplessly inside it. We had to be incredibly surgical and infinitely patient. We had to quietly untangle Natalie's identity from the fraudulent holding company without triggering any automated alerts or administrative alarms that would notify Cameron. We had to build an airtight legal wall around her personal trust fund and her individual assets, gathering indisputable proof that she was a victim of severe identity theft, all while I continued to play the frail and easily manipulated father-in-law. I drank the scotch, feeling the liquid fire burn down my throat. The game had fundamentally changed from a simple aggressive defense of my wealth to a high-stakes rescue mission. I was absolutely going to rip Cameron's entire life apart piece by piece, but first, I had to ensure my daughter was standing safely out of the blast radius. The heavy thud of knuckles against my front door echoed through the quiet house just before noon on Wednesday. I was not expecting company. I placed my glass of water on the kitchen counter and walked slowly toward the foyer, maintaining the slight shuffle I had adopted for my new persona. I pulled back the sheer curtain covering the side window. Standing on my porch was Cameron. Next to him stood a tall, thin man carrying a worn leather briefcase. The stranger wore a cheap suit that hung loosely off his shoulders and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a severe clinical appearance. I opened the door, letting my shoulders slump forward. I offered a wavering, confused smile. Cameron did not wait for an invitation. He stepped right over the threshold and guided the stranger into my home, invading my sanctuary with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he already owned the title deed. He spoke in that same loud, patronizing tone he had used at brunch. He told me he was so sorry for dropping by unannounced, but that Natalie had been crying all morning. He claimed my daughter was terribly worried about my failing memory and my declining health. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and introduced the stranger as Dr. Aris, claiming he was a highly respected private behavioral specialist who made discreet house calls for elite clients. The audacity of using my daughter's name as a weapon to force his way into my home made a violent surge of anger rise in my throat. I knew Natalie had not been crying about my memory. Natalie was completely oblivious to this entire operation. Cameron was using her pure love for me as a crowbar to pry open my legal defenses. I looked at the man introduced as Dr. Aris. His eyes darted around my foyer, taking inventory of the antiques and the architecture, not assessing my physical condition. A genuine medical professional looks at the patient. A thief looks at the valuables. I knew exactly what this was. Cameron was not here to check on my well-being. He was here to establish a documented baseline of dementia. He needed a formal medical evaluation of cognitive decline to force a medical power of attorney, which would give him absolute legal control to liquidate my assets. I invited them into the living room, allowing my hands to shake noticeably as I gestured toward the sofa. I sat down in my favorite armchair, sinking deep into the cushions to look smaller and more vulnerable. Cameron sat next to the doctor, leaning forward with an expression of fabricated sympathy. He told me that they just wanted to ask a few simple questions to put Natalie's beautiful mind at ease. I nodded slowly, widening my eyes to project the perfect image of a frightened, overwhelmed elderly man. I told them I would do anything to make my little girl stop worrying. The evaluation began. It was a humiliating theatrical performance designed to strip me of my dignity in my own home. Dr. Aris opened his briefcase and pulled out a notepad and a silver pen. He asked me in a slow, soothing voice if I knew what day of the week it was. I hesitated deliberately. I looked toward the window, then down at my hands, and finally muttered that it must be Sunday because the neighborhood was so quiet. Cameron let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking his head tragically. The doctor wrote something down and then asked me what year it was. I closed my eyes and massaged my temples, pretending to struggle with a thick mental fog. I gave him a year that was exactly 1 decade in the past. I watched the doctor's pen glide across the paper, officially documenting my severe cognitive detachment from reality. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I stumbled on the third number, apologizing profusely and claiming my mind just felt so cloudy lately. I let my voice crack slightly, a masterful touch of vulnerability that I knew would completely convince them of their total victory. Cameron leaned back against the sofa cushions, struggling to conceal the gleam of absolute triumph in his eyes. He believed he was witnessing the final pathetic decay of a formerly successful man. He had no idea he was watching a seasoned corporate predator execute a flawless defensive maneuver. I leaned into the skid completely. I asked Cameron if Natalie was angry with me for forgetting things. I let a tear pool in the corner of my eye. Cameron quickly grabbed my shaking hand and told me that no one was angry. He said they just wanted to protect me from hurting myself or making terrible mistakes with my finances. Dr. Aris closed his notepad with a sharp snap. He turned to Cameron and stated in a clinical, authoritative voice that my cognitive decline was severe and rapidly accelerating. He announced that I required immediate continuous supervision and that I was completely unfit to manage my own medical or financial affairs. The diagnosis was delivered with the swiftness of a fast food order. No genuine tests, no blood work, just a 5-minute conversation designed to rubber stamp a corporate theft. The doctor reached into his briefcase again. He pulled out a small orange prescription bottle and placed it deliberately on my coffee table. He said he was prescribing a heavy sedative to help with my confusion and agitation. He insisted I start taking the pills immediately. Then Cameron pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from his jacket pocket and laid them next to the pills. It was a comprehensive medical directive and a durable power of attorney. The documents would legally surrender every ounce of my autonomy directly to Cameron. Cameron spoke softly, treating me like a frightened toddler. He told me that I needed to review the papers and sign them to give him the legal right to take care of me. He said he did not want to rush me today because I was clearly too tired from the evaluation. He promised to return on Friday afternoon to collect the signed directive. He warned me to rest and take my new medication, assuring me that everything was going to be perfectly fine once he took control. I looked at the documents and the pills on my table. I nodded meekly, whispering a quiet thank you. They stood up and walked toward the front door. Cameron did not look back. He felt absolutely confident that the trap was perfectly set and ready to spring shut on Friday. I stayed seated in my armchair until I heard the heavy engine of Cameron's luxury vehicle start and fade down the street. The moment the house was silent, my slumping posture vanished entirely. I sat up straight, the manufactured tremor in my hands completely gone. I stared at the orange prescription bottle sitting next to the legal documents. I did not touch the pills. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my vibrating phone. The screen displayed a secure incoming call from Warren. I answered immediately, asking him what he had found. Warren sounded breathless, his voice tight with urgent energy. He told me he had run the license plates of the vehicle parked in my driveway through his forensic databases. He tracked the registration to the man Cameron had just brought into my home. Warren told me I needed to be extremely careful. The man was not a private behavioral specialist. His real name was Aris Thorne. He had completely lost his medical license 3 years ago after being convicted of massive prescription fraud and selling heavy narcotics on the black market. He was a disgraced criminal masquerading as a doctor for cash. A dark, chilling realization swept over me as I looked at the orange bottle sitting on my coffee table. Cameron had not just brought a fake doctor to rubber stamp a fraudulent diagnosis. He had brought a convicted narcotics dealer into my home to supply me with heavy, unprescribed sedatives. If I had actually taken those pills, I would have been completely incapacitated by Friday. My mind would have been truly foggy. I would have been chemically subdued, easy to manipulate, and completely unable to fight back when he returned to force my signature on those legal documents. They were not just trying to steal my wealth through legal loopholes anymore. They were actively attempting to poison me to ensure my compliance. The silent war had just escalated into a physical threat, and I knew exactly how I was going to respond. I hung up the phone with Warren, walked into my study, and began preparing for Friday. Cameron wanted a helpless victim, but I was going to give him a ghost. The fake pills sat on my kitchen counter like a poisonous promise. I had survived the medical ambush, but the clock was mercilessly ticking down. Having brilliant legal and financial minds on my side was a massive advantage, but strategy was entirely useless without raw, indisputable proof. I needed the original digital blueprints of the Shadow Company. I needed the exact forged documents Cameron had used to tie my innocent daughter to his criminal enterprise, and I needed them before he finalized the transfer. It was Saturday night. Natalie had mentioned weeks ago that she and Cameron were attending a high-profile charity gala downtown for the local children's hospital. It was the perfect alibi for a rising young executive trying to look philanthropic. It was also the perfect window for a father trying to save his daughter's life. I parked my faded sedan 3 blocks away from their sprawling modern craftsman home, pulling my dark coat tight against the evening chill. I walked through the shadows of the manicured neighborhood, keeping my head down, blending into the quiet suburban night. When I reached their front porch, I pulled out the shiny brass spare key Natalie had given me months ago for emergencies. Cameron had laughed at the time, joking that I would probably forget I even had it. I slid the key into the heavy deadbolt. The door clicked open, and immediately the sleek digital keypad on the wall began to beep its urgent warning. I had 30 seconds until the police dispatch was triggered. Cameron had bragged extensively about this state-of-the-art security system. He boasted that it was completely impenetrable. What my arrogant son-in-law did not realize was that I had secretly funded the entire construction of this house through a blind subsidiary. I knew the security installation company intimately. I knew the exact model of the alarm, and more importantly, I possessed the master override code programmed directly by the manufacturer. I calmly typed a sequence of 8 digits into the keypad. The red flashing light instantly turned a solid, pacified green. The fortress was disarmed. I moved swiftly through the silent, pristine house. I did not bother looking at the expensive modern art or the luxury furniture my stolen money was likely paying for. I walked straight down the hall to Cameron's private home office. The room reeked of his expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. His massive desktop computer sat on a polished mahogany desk, humming quietly in sleep mode. I sat down in his heavy leather executive chair and pulled a small, heavy black flash drive from my pocket. Warren had built this custom decryption tool specifically for this mission. I plugged the device directly into the hidden port on the back of the tower. The screen flared to life, immediately bypassing the password prompt. A black terminal window popped up, and lines of green code began to rapidly scroll across the monitor. Warren's software was aggressively tunneling through the encrypted firewalls, cloning every single file, email, and hidden directory on the hard drive. I sat in the dark, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. 10%. 30%. The tension in the quiet room was suffocating. I was downloading the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. Every forged signature, every wire transfer, every piece of fake documentation tying Natalie to the holding company was bleeding into my pocket. 60%. 80%. I kept my eyes glued to the monitor, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. Finally, the screen flashed a solid green message indicating the cloning process was 100% complete. I pulled the flash drive free and slipped it safely into my inner coat pocket. I turned off the monitor, stood up, and pushed the leather chair exactly back to where I had found it. I was just turning toward the hallway when the sharp, undeniable sound of the heavy front door unlocking echoed through the quiet house. My blood ran completely cold. Natalie and Cameron were supposed to be at the charity gala for at least another 3 hours. I froze, listening intently. The heavy door swung shut. The security keypad beeped twice, meaning whoever entered knew the standard access code. I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels striking the hardwood floor. It was a fast, confident stride. It did not sound like my daughter. The footsteps were moving directly down the hallway toward the office. I had absolutely no time to reach the back door. I stepped backward silently, sliding open the heavy wooden door of the walk-in storage closet adjacent to the desk. I slipped inside into the pitch-black darkness, pulling the door shut just a fraction of an inch before the office lights violently flicked on. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold plaster wall, surrounded by boxes of office supplies and filing cabinets. Through the tiny sliver of the cracked door, I had a clear line of sight to the mahogany desk. A woman walked into the room. She was not wearing a gala gown, and she was absolutely not my daughter. She wore a sleek designer trench coat and carried a luxury leather handbag. She carelessly kicked off her heels and walked behind the desk, pouring herself a glass of bourbon from the private decanter. She moved with the absolute comfort and entitlement of someone who owned the house. When she turned to the side, the desk lamp illuminated her sharp features. It was Valerie, the shadow wife, the woman from the catering uniform at the wedding. She was using my daughter's home as her own personal sanctuary the moment Natalie was out of the house. The sheer sociopathic audacity of it made a dark, violent fury rise in my throat, but my corporate discipline held me perfectly still. I reached into my pocket, slowly pulled out my smartphone, and silently activated the voice recorder app. Valerie took a long sip of the bourbon, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. She put the call on speaker and tossed the phone onto the polished desk. A moment later, Cameron's voice filled the room, sounding hushed and irritated. He asked her why she was calling him while he was sitting at a charity dinner with Natalie. Valerie laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the office walls. She told him she was sitting in his office drinking his expensive bourbon and that she was growing incredibly impatient. She demanded to know why the residential liquidation of my estate had not been finalized yet. She complained that playing the ghost was becoming exhausting and that she wanted her half of the payout immediately. Cameron's voice dropped to an angry, frantic whisper over the speaker. He told her to lower her voice and calm down. He explained that I was degenerating perfectly according to schedule. He bragged that I had fallen completely for the fake doctor routine and that he was going to collect my signature on the medical directive in a matter of days. He promised her that by the end of the month, the old man would be locked away in a ward, Natalie would be saddled with the legal fallout, and they would be sitting on a beach with millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts. Valerie sighed loudly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. She warned him that if he did not speed up the timeline, she would simply drain the Shadow Limited Liability Company herself and leave him to face the federal consequences alone. She hung up the phone without waiting for his reply, finishing her drink in one long swallow. I stood perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of the closet, my phone capturing every single syllable of their treason. The digital flash drive in my pocket held the blueprint of their crimes, and the audio recording in my hand held their explicit, undeniable confessions. I just had to wait for her to leave the room so I could slip back out into the night and prepare the final devastating blow. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the neighborhood. I sat alone at my modest kitchen table, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The fake prescription pills from the disgraced doctor still sat untouched on the counter, exactly where they had been left on Wednesday. I had spent the last 48 hours perfectly calibrating my mind for this exact encounter. Today was the day my son-in-law believed he was going to legally strip away my autonomy. He thought he was coming to collect the ultimate prize. I folded my hands together and waited in the quiet house, letting the silence sharpen my focus. When the heavy knock finally echoed through the hallway, it did not sound like a family member dropping by for a visit. It sounded like a landlord arriving to collect a debt. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my shoulders to hunch forward and my spine to curve. I practiced the slight shuffle in my step as I walked toward the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, offering a weak, trembling smile. Cameron stood on my porch, radiating an arrogant, predatory energy. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful young executive he pretended to be. Standing right next to him was a short, balding man clutching a cheap leather briefcase. The stranger avoided my gaze, shifting his weight nervously from side to side. He looked exactly like a man who was being paid under the table to look the other way. Cameron pushed past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He guided the nervous stranger into my kitchen and introduced him as a certified state notary. He claimed this man was a highly recommended professional who had agreed to do a special home visit just for us. I knew immediately that this was another lie. A legitimate notary requires rigid identification protocols and asks specific questions to ensure the signer is of sound mind and acting without coercion. This sweaty, nervous man was merely a bribed accomplice brought in to rubber stamp a massive corporate theft. I shuffled into the kitchen and slowly lowered myself into a wooden chair, playing the part of the exhausted, confused old man perfectly. Cameron unbuckled his expensive briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He placed them carefully on the table right in front of me, spreading them out like a winning hand of poker. The bold black letters at the top of the pages were unmistakable. Durable power of attorney and comprehensive medical directive. Cameron pulled up a chair and sat extremely close to me, invading my personal space. He placed a heavy hand over mine, squeezing it, with a sickeningly sweet, false tenderness. He leaned in and spoke in a soft, patronizing voice, treating me like a frightened child. He told me that Natalie was so incredibly worried about my fading memory and my physical decline. He said that reviewing these documents broke his heart, but it was the only way to truly protect the family. He promised that if I signed these papers, I would never have to worry about paying another bill, scheduling another doctor appointment, or managing my confusing property taxes ever again. He painted a beautiful, comforting picture of a stress-free retirement. He assured me that he would handle all the heavy burdens so I could just relax and enjoy my golden years. He was looking me right in the eyes, telling me he loved me like a father, while simultaneously pushing the paperwork that would allow him to steal my home, drain my bank accounts, and lock me inside a psychiatric ward by the end of the month. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of his performance was almost impressive. If I had not listened to him conspiring with his shadow wife in the dark closet of his home office, I might have actually believed the genuine concern dripping from his voice. I let my lower lip tremble slightly. I looked up at him with wide, watering eyes projecting absolute vulnerability. I whispered a quiet, broken thank you, telling him how lucky my daughter was to have found such a strong, capable husband to take care of her old father. Cameron smiled broadly, handing the nervous notary a silent look of triumph. He tapped the signature lines at the bottom of the thick legal stack. He told me all I needed to do was sign my name on the dotted lines, and he would take care of absolutely everything else. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded cardigan. I told Cameron that my hands had been shaking so badly lately that I could only write properly with my favorite old pen. I pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. It was a beautiful vintage piece, slightly scuffed from decades of use. Cameron nodded eagerly, completely unconcerned with the writing instrument. He just wanted the ink on the paper. I uncapped the silver's pen with a deliberately clumsy, trembling hand. I lowered the nib to the thick, expensive paper and began to sign my name. I let my hand shake violently, dragging the pen across the dotted lines to create a frail, jagged signature that perfectly matched the profile of a man suffering from severe cognitive decline. I signed the durable power of attorney, granting Cameron absolute control over my financial portfolio. I signed the comprehensive medical directive, giving him the legal authority to commit me to a specialized facility against my will. I signed every single page, initialing the margins exactly where the bribed notary aggressively pointed his sweaty finger. The notary did not ask to see my driver license. He did not ask if I understood the massive legal weight of the documents I was signing. He simply took his heavy brass stamp and forcefully pressed it into the bottom of every page, finalizing the fraudulent transfer of power. He hastily signed his own name, gathered his fee from Cameron, and practically ran out the front door, eager to escape the scene of the crime. Cameron gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the kitchen table to align them perfectly. He could not completely hide the massive, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He had won. He possessed the legal keys to my entire kingdom. He slid the papers back into his leather briefcase, snapping the locks shut with a loud, definitive click. He stood up, patted me on the shoulder one last time, and told me to get some rest. He promised he would come back on Monday to start sorting out the transition. He walked out of my house with the confident swagger of a conqueror. I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table, listening to his car engine start and fade down the street. The moment the house was entirely silent, I dropped the hunched posture. My spine straightened. My hands stopped shaking completely. I picked up the vintage silver fountain pen from the table and slowly screwed the cap back on. Cameron thought he was walking away with my entire life in his briefcase. He had absolutely no idea what was actually loaded inside the ink cartridge of my pen. Back in the 1980s, when I was drafting massive commercial blueprints by hand, I used a highly specific industrial drafting fluid. It was a volatile chemical compound designed for temporary architectural markings. When the fluid was exposed to ambient room temperature and standard ultraviolet sunlight, it underwent a rapid chemical evaporation process. I had carefully drained the standard ink from my fountain pen the night before and filled the cartridge completely to the brim with this precise industrial fluid. I had just signed away my fortune, my home, and my autonomy using an ink that was currently disintegrating into thin air. Cameron was driving back to his house right now, celebrating his massive victory with his shadow wife. He would lock those notarized documents inside his home safe over the weekend, waiting for Monday morning to march into my banks and legally seize my assets. But within exactly 48 hours, the chemical compound would completely vanish from the paper without leaving a single trace or residue behind. When Cameron opened his briefcase on Monday to execute his hostile takeover, he was going to find a thick stack of completely blank pages. He had just walked out of my house carrying a ticking time bomb, and the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. The ink from my silver pen was already beginning its silent microscopic evaporation the moment Cameron walked out my front door. He had the power of attorney and the medical directive tucked safely in his briefcase, but those documents were useless until Monday morning when the banks opened. I had bought myself a 48-hour window. Now I needed to use every single second of it to lock down the most vulnerable target in his entire operation: my daughter's trust fund. When Natalie was born, I established a comprehensive, irrevocable trust designed to secure her future regardless of what happened to my commercial real estate empire. It was a massive financial safety net, completely insulated from market volatility and corporate liabilities. Cameron knew about the trust. He knew the exact balance, and he knew that as her legally wedded husband, he had established joint marital access to the account under the guise of managing their new life together. According to the itinerary I had memorized in his home office, step 2 of his liquidation plan was scheduled for Tuesday. He intended to wire the entire contents of her trust directly into the shadow holding company he had co-signed with her stolen Social Security number. If that wire transfer went through, the money would be instantaneously scattered across untraceable offshore accounts, and Natalie would be left completely destitute. I could not simply call my daughter and tell her to change her bank passwords. If I warned her, she would inevitably confront Cameron. She was innocent and deeply in love. She would demand an explanation, and Cameron would immediately realize his entire criminal operation had been compromised. He would panic, and he would use the leverage he had already established to drag her down with him. I had to freeze the massive account completely without her ever knowing it had been frozen until it was safe to tell her the truth. Saturday morning, I drove my old sedan past the local neighborhood bank branches and headed directly for the towering regional headquarters downtown. I bypassed the busy teller lines and the junior loan officers, walking straight toward the frosted glass executive suites on the top floor. The regional director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, had managed my highest-level commercial accounts for 15 years. She knew the unkempt old man in the faded sweater was just a carefully constructed performance. I sat down in her polished office and handed her a thick manila folder. Inside was the original founding charter of Natalie's trust document. I told Sarah I needed to initiate a total lockdown on the account immediately, but it had to be done without triggering any standard fraud alerts that would prompt a phone call to my daughter. Sarah frowned, adjusting her glasses as she looked over the paperwork. She explained that because Cameron had legally established joint access, any unilateral freeze initiated by me as the original grantor could be contested in court. She warned me that standard procedure required the bank to notify all authorized account holders immediately if a hard freeze was implemented. I leaned forward, resting my hands on her desk. I told her I was not requesting a standard fraud freeze. I instructed her to turn to page 42 of the original trust charter and execute the distress protocol. Sarah flipped through the heavy parchment pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. 20 years ago, when I first drafted the trust with Fletcher, we had anticipated the possibility of a hostile actor gaining undue influence over Natalie. We embedded a highly obscure, heavily encrypted contingency clause deep within the administrative guidelines. The distress protocol was designed specifically for catastrophic emergency scenarios. When activated, it did not freeze the account. It fundamentally altered the security requirements for outbound capital. Sarah read the clause aloud, her voice filled with quiet, professional awe. The protocol mandated that the moment it was invoked, any outward wire transfer, exceeding $10,000, required extreme dual verification. The transaction could not be authorized digitally or over the phone. Both authorized account holders, Natalie and Cameron, would have to physically walk into a primary bank branch stand in front of a senior manager and provide dual biometric signature verification simultaneously. It was a brilliant, invisible cage. Cameron could log into the banking portal. He could view the massive balance. He could even initiate the transfer routing the money to his shadow company. But the moment he clicked, confirm, the system would quietly block the transaction and demand physical dual presence. He would not be able to steal the money without dragging Natalie physically into the bank to authorize the theft of her own fortune, which he obviously could not do without exposing his entire criminal plot. Sarah typed her executive override credentials into the banking terminal. She bypassed the standard security protocols and manually activated the distress protocol on the trust. The system accepted the command with a quiet, definitive chime. The vault was officially locked. Sarah looked at me and assured me that the funds were absolutely secure. I thanked her, stood up, and walked out of the executive suite, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. My daughter's future was safe. But my relief was incredibly short-lived. I had miscalculated one microscopic technical detail in the bank's automated notification system. While the distress protocol bypassed the standard fraud alert phone calls, it automatically generated a routine administrative receipt. The moment Sarah finalized the security update, the bank's servers automatically dispatched a generic email confirming an adjustment to the account's security parameters. The email was sent directly to Natalie's primary inbox. I was driving back to my house feeling the quiet satisfaction of a successful maneuver when my burner phone, the one Warren had provided, vibrated violently in the passenger seat. It was an emergency text from Warren. He had been monitoring Cameron's digital footprint continuously. The message was short and terrifying. Cameron just intercepted the bank's automated email. He knows the account security was altered. He just tried to initiate a test transfer of $50,000. The system blocked him. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the old sedan sharply onto the shoulder of the road. My heart hammered against my ribs. Cameron monitored my daughter's personal email. The level of control he exerted over her life was absolute and sickening. He had intercepted the security alert and immediately tested the boundaries of the cage I had just locked him inside. He knew his access was blocked. He knew someone with high-level executive authority had intentionally sabotaged his timeline. And he knew the only person who possessed that level of authority was the fragile, forgetful old widower he had just patronized in the kitchen the day before. The careful, meticulous game of chess I had been playing in the shadows was over. The silent war was now incredibly loud. Cameron was no longer a smug, confident thief operating in the dark. He was a desperate, cornered animal whose entire multi-million-dollar heist had just hit an impenetrable brick wall. He was losing control, and men like Cameron turn violently unpredictable when they lose control. I stared at the road ahead, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The fragile old man persona was useless now. The predator knew I was awake. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, waiting for the storm to break inside my house. I knew Cameron was coming. The moment Warren texted me about the intercepted bank alert, I knew the arrogant corporate thief would not wait for daylight. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and I had just ripped the steering wheel out of his hands. The digital clock on my microwave glowed a faint green, displaying exactly midnight. The house was dead silent, but my senses were heightened, perfectly tuned to the perimeter of my property. I did not turn on a single light. I simply sat at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of cold water, letting my breathing slow to a steady, calculated rhythm. The violent crash of splintering wood shattered the quiet of the night. It did not come from the front porch. It came from the back patio. The heavy wooden door leading into my kitchen was kicked open with such savage force that the deadbolt tore completely through the doorframe. The door slammed against the interior wall, shaking the entire house. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded across the tile floor. Cameron stormed into the kitchen, breathing raggedly, his chest heaving under his soaked designer jacket. The polite, respectful son-in-law was completely gone. The mask had been violently ripped away, revealing the desperate, cornered predator underneath. I immediately dropped my glass of water, allowing it to shatter across the tile floor. I pushed myself backward against the kitchen counter, raising my trembling hands defensively. I let my eyes widen in absolute manufactured terror. Cameron did not even look at the broken glass. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, moving with a physical aggression I had never seen him display. He grabbed the collar of my faded sweater and slammed me hard against the granite edge of the counter. His face was mere inches from mine. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of adrenaline and the faint odor of expensive whiskey on his breath. "What did you do, you miserable old fool?" he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He did not speak loud and slow anymore. He spoke with a vicious, venomous speed. He asked me what I had told the regional director at the bank. He demanded to know how an incompetent, senile widower had managed to activate a locked distress protocol on a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He shook me violently, telling me that his access was denied and that the funds were trapped. I let my jaw tremble, stammering incoherently. I told him I did not know what he was talking about, claiming I had only gone to the bank to check my checking account balance. Cameron laughed, a dark, cruel sound that held no humor. He let go of my sweater and paced across the kitchen, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. He told me to drop the confused act. He said he went to his home safe to review the power of attorney documents he had forced me to sign just 24 hours prior. He screamed that the ink was disappearing. He said the signatures were fading right off the heavy legal paper, leaving him with a stack of worthless blank pages. He realized he had been played, but his arrogant mind simply could not accept that I was the architect of his failure. He accused me of hiring a malicious lawyer to sabotage his family plans. I continued to cower against the cold marble counter, sliding down slightly, to appear even smaller and more helpless. I begged him to calm down, pleading with him not to hurt me. I told him Natalie would be terrified if she knew he was acting this way. That was exactly the trigger he was waiting for. Cameron stopped pacing and slowly walked back toward me. His eyes were cold, empty voids. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the counter on either side of me, physically trapping me in place. He told me in a dangerously quiet voice that Natalie was never going to find out about his behavior, because Natalie was going to be completely ruined if I did not do exactly what he commanded. He outlined his backup plan with chilling precision. He told me that over the past 6 months, he had carefully routed dozens of fraudulent commercial transactions directly through Natalie's personal work computer. He had intentionally used her private digital signatures to authorize the transfer of stolen corporate funds from his marketing firm. He boasted that he had created a perfect, flawless paper trail that painted my beautiful, innocent daughter as the sole mastermind of a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. He smiled a sick, twisted smile and told me that the federal authorities would not look twice at him. They would see a brilliant, manipulative wife who had used her oblivious husband to steal millions of dollars. The absolute cruelty of his extortion was staggering. He was looking a father right in the eyes, threatening to send his only child to federal prison for decades. He laid out his final ultimatum. He told me that on Monday morning I was going to walk into the downtown bank branch with him. He said I was going to sit in front of the regional director, smile my pathetic, senile smile, and personally authorize the immediate release of the distress protocol on the trust fund. He demanded that I verify the outward wire transfer directly into his shadow holding company. He told me that if I hesitated for a single second, or if I tried to signal the bank tellers for help, he would press one button on his phone and send the fabricated embezzlement evidence directly to the district attorney. I let a sob tear through my throat. I buried my face in my trembling hands, crying genuine tears of overwhelming distress. I fell to my knees, weeping openly on the kitchen floor amidst the shattered glass of my water cup. I pleaded with him not to hurt my daughter. I apologized profusely, begging for his forgiveness, claiming I had been confused by a bank teller and did not mean to cause any trouble. I promised him I would do absolutely everything he wanted. I swore on my life that I would go to the bank on Monday morning and release every single penny into his accounts. I told him he could have the house, the trust, the commercial properties, and everything I owned as long as he left Natalie alone. Cameron looked down at me with absolute unvarnished disgust. He saw exactly what he expected to see. A broken, defeated old man completely crushed by the superior intellect and raw power of a younger predator. He reached down and patted my cheek in a mocking, degrading gesture. He told me I was finally starting to understand how the real world worked. He ordered me to stay inside the house all weekend and warned me not to answer the phone for anyone. He promised he would arrive at exactly 8 in the morning on Monday to drive me to the bank. He turned around and walked out through the splintered back door, kicking a piece of broken wood out of his path. I remained on my knees on the cold tile floor, listening to the heavy footsteps recede into the rainy night. I heard the engine of his luxury vehicle roar to life and the tires screech against the wet asphalt as he sped away from my property. I waited until the sound completely faded into the distance. The storm continued to blow outside, casting long, shifting shadows across my kitchen. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. The tears instantly stopped. The trembling in my limbs vanished entirely. I slowly stood up, brushing a stray piece of shattered glass from my knee. I walked over to the center of the kitchen island. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I reached my hand underneath the thick overhang of the granite countertop, running my fingers along the hidden seam of the woodwork. My fingers brushed against a small rectangular plastic device firmly attached to the wood with industrial adhesive. I pressed the tiny tactile button on the side of the device until a miniature red light stopped blinking. I pulled the digital audio recorder free from the counter and held it in my palm. Cameron thought he had just secured his ultimate victory through brute force and terror. He believed he had successfully blackmailed a helpless victim into surrendering a fortune. What he had actually done was stand in the middle of my kitchen and deliver a crystal-clear, uninterrupted confession to felony extortion, severe elder abuse, and the deliberate fabrication of federal embezzlement charges. He had explicitly detailed his entire criminal plot, including his intent to frame his own wife and his attempt to coerce a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. I placed the audio recorder safely into my pocket. The monster had finally taken off his mask, and I had captured his true face perfectly. 1 month after I walked my only daughter down the aisle, her wedding photographer called me in a panic. "Sir," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I noticed something terrible in the background of the reception photos. Come to my studio immediately, and whatever you do, do not tell your daughter." When I saw what my brand new son-in-law was handing to the catering manager in the shadows of the banquet hall, my blood ran cold. "My name is Russell. I am 66 years old, and for the last 10 years since my beloved wife passed away, I have lived a very quiet, very simple life. to my daughter Natalie, and especially to her new husband Cameron. I am just a retired pension-reliant widower who spends his days tending to a modest vegetable garden and reading history books on the porch. I drive a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door. I wear flannel shirts I buy on clearance, and I am always careful to mention how tight my budget is when we go out to dinner. That is exactly what I wanted them to believe. What Cameron did not know, what no one except my oldest friends knew, was that before my supposed retirement, I spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire. I did not rely on a fixed monthly pension. I quietly managed a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. I chose this invisible life to protect my daughter, to ensure she grew up valuing hard work over a trust fund, and to shield us from the exact kind of greedy predators that immense wealth always attracts. I sat in the ruins of my kitchen until the sun began to rise. The shattered wood from the back door lay scattered across the floor, a physical reminder of the monster that had invaded my home. But I did not clean it up. I did not call a repairman. The broken door was irrelevant now. My entire focus narrowed to a single razor-sharp objective. I had the digital evidence of the forged holding company. I had the audio recording of the extortion. I had enough leverage to send my son-in-law and his shadow wife to federal prison for decades. But simply handing the evidence over to the authorities was not an option. If the police arrived at my daughter's house with arrest warrants, Cameron would immediately play the victim. He would twist the narrative, manipulating my sweet Natalie into believing that her cruel, controlling father had framed her loving husband. He would drag her down with him, using her signature on those forged documents to guarantee her destruction alongside his own. I could not let the law blindside her. I had to force her to see the truth with her own eyes. I had to shatter the illusion so completely that Cameron would have nowhere to hide. I needed a controlled environment. I needed an arena where I held absolute authority, a place where I could seal the exits and control the flow of information. I picked up my burner phone and made a call to an old associate who managed an exclusive high-end restaurant downtown. The establishment featured a highly secure private dining room, traditionally used for confidential corporate mergers. I reserved the room for that evening, giving very specific instructions regarding the electronic locking mechanisms on the heavy mahogany doors. With the venue secured, I had to lay the bait. I needed to convince Cameron that his violent midnight extortion had worked perfectly. I needed to stroke his massive ego until he was utterly blind to the snare closing around his ankles. I dialed his personal number. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with condescension and arrogant impatience. He asked if I was calling to confirm our Monday morning trip to the bank. I pitched my voice to sound completely broken. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, projecting the image of a defeated, exhausted old man who had finally surrendered to the inevitable. I apologized to him. I told him that the stress of the last few days had taken a terrible toll on my heart. I whimpered slightly, claiming that I was too weak to fight anymore and that I just wanted peace for my family. I told him he had won. I agreed to sign over the entire commercial portfolio, release the locked trust fund, and transfer the estate without any further resistance. I heard his sharp intake of breath over the phone. The greedy anticipation in his silence was palpable. But then I laid out my single condition. I told him that I refused to do a transaction of this magnitude standing in a cold public bank lobby. I insisted that we needed to finalize the transfer with dignity in a private setting where we could sit down as a family and put an end to the tension. I gave him the address of the restaurant and the reservation details for the private dining room. I told him to bring all the new ironclad contracts he needed me to sign. Then I added the hook. I requested that he bring his wealth manager, the financial associate handling the creation of his holding company, so we could expedite the transfer immediately without waiting for standard banking hours. I knew exactly who he would bring. He would bring Valerie. They were too greedy and too arrogant to pass up the opportunity to witness my absolute surrender together. Finally, I insisted that Natalie must be there. I claimed that my lawyers required her to sign a familial consent release to ensure the transfer could never be contested in probate court. I told him it was just a formality, but a necessary one to finalize the surrender. Cameron swallowed the lie without a single moment of hesitation. His ego completely overshadowed any lingering caution. He agreed to the terms, his voice practically trembling with victorious excitement. He promised they would be there at 7 o'clock sharp, assuring me that I was making the smartest decision of my life. I hung up the phone and stared out the window. The trap was loaded. The only thing left to do was wait for the prey. I arrived at the restaurant 2 hours early. The general manager escorted me into the private dining room. It was a spacious, opulent space with thick, soundproof walls, heavy velvet curtains, and a massive mahogany table positioned in the center. I walked over to the discrete control panel on the wall and tested the electronic locks. With the press of a button, heavy steel bolts engaged silently inside the doorframes, sealing the room completely from the inside. I then turned my attention to the large, high-definition television screen mounted on the far wall. It was typically used for corporate slideshows. I plugged my silver flash drive into the hidden media port and tested the remote control in my pocket. The high-resolution wedding photograph flashed onto the screen with devastating clarity. I turned the screen off, leaving it dark and unassuming. I took my seat at the far end of the long table, folded my hands, and waited in the quiet, ambient light. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Cameron walked in first. He wore a sharp, tailored suit and carried a sleek, new leather briefcase. He radiated absolute, unvarnished triumph. He walked with the swagger of a king entering his newly conquered territory. Right behind him was Valerie. She wore a sophisticated business suit, her hair pulled back into a severe professional style. She carried a sleek tablet playing the role of the high-level wealth manager to absolute perfection. Her dark eyes swept the room, landing on me with a look of barely concealed predatory satisfaction. And then my daughter walked into the room. Seeing Natalie sent a sharp, agonizing ache through my chest. She wore a simple, elegant dress, but her face looked tired and deeply confused. She clearly did not understand why we were having a formal business dinner on a Saturday night. She looked at me with genuine, innocent concern, taking a step forward to ask if my health was truly all right. Cameron immediately intercepted her, placing a controlling hand on the small of her back and guiding her to a chair near the center of the table. He played the doting, protective husband, flawlessly pulling her chair out and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Valerie took the seat directly across from me, placing her tablet on the table with a sharp, decisive click. She offered me a crisp, entirely fabricated professional smile, introducing herself under a fake corporate alias. She claimed she was there to ensure the transition of my assets was handled smoothly and efficiently. Cameron sat down next to Natalie, unbuckled his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of fresh legal contracts. These were not the fading documents from my kitchen. These were newly printed, ironclad agreements designed to strip me of everything I owned the moment my pen touched the paper. Cameron smoothed the documents out on the mahogany table, pushing them gently toward my side of the table. He looked at me with cold, victorious eyes, entirely convinced that he had broken me. He believed I was a terrified, defeated old man sitting across from an unstoppable corporate force. He believed Natalie was completely under his spell, oblivious to the fact that her husband and his real wife were sitting right next to her, preparing to drain her future. The room was perfectly quiet. The heavy doors were shut. The players were all exactly where I needed them to be, breathing the same air in a sealed arena. Cameron tapped the signature line on the top contract, offering me a sleek black pen. He had absolute certainty that he had won the war. He did not know the battle was only just beginning. The air in the private dining room was thick and suffocating. The heavy mahogany table felt less like a place for a family meal, and more like a butcher block prepared for an execution. Cameron sat back in his plush leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He looked at me with the lazy, satisfied expression of a predator that had finally backed its prey into an inescapable corner. Beside him sat Valerie. She was a master of deception, perfectly playing the role of a high-level wealth manager. She arranged her sleek digital tablet and stacked her expensive legal folders with sharp, precise movements. She did not even bother to hide the contempt in her eyes when she looked at me. To her, I was just a pathetic obstacle that was finally being swept away. She looked at my faded sweater and worn-out trousers with open disgust. She leaned across the table and introduced herself under a fabricated corporate alias. She spoke to me as if I were a slow child, telling me that this transition would be best for everyone, and that I should be grateful a professional firm was stepping in to clean up my messy financial history. She was enjoying this immensely. She was relishing the opportunity to sit across from the man she was robbing and force him to surrender his own kingdom to her face. But it was my daughter who shattered my heart all over again. Natalie sat between her husband and this imposter, looking completely lost and entirely out of place. She wore a beautiful, simple dress, but her hands were twisting nervously in her lap. She kept glancing at me with genuine, deep concern. She did not understand the aggressive energy radiating from her husband. She asked Cameron if we could just order food and talk about my health first. Cameron dismissed her immediately, telling her that the adult business needed to be concluded before we could relax. It was sickening to watch him diminish her. She thought she was here to comfort a sick, failing father. She had no idea she was sitting right next to the architects of her own destruction. A waiter silently entered the room, pouring water and leaving a basket of warm bread before quickly bowing out. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him, isolating us completely from the bustling restaurant outside. The moment the latch clicked, Cameron dropped the last remnants of his polite son-in-law facade. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished wood. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not pretend to care about my health anymore. He simply tapped the thick stack of freshly printed contracts sitting in front of Valerie. He told me in a cold, flat voice that it was time to put an end to this pathetic charade. He said he had brought the final transfer documents to consolidate my entire commercial real estate portfolio and release the frozen trust fund. He spoke with the absolute authority of a man who believed he held all the cards. Valerie slid the heavy stack of papers across the smooth mahogany surface until they rested directly in front of me. She handed me a sleek black pen with a completely devoid, empty smile. She told me that the clauses were non-negotiable and that signing them immediately was the only way to avoid a messy public legal battle that would ruin my daughter's reputation. Natalie jolted in her chair, her eyes darting frantically between Cameron and me. She asked what legal battle they were talking about. She asked why they were forcing me to sign commercial real estate documents when I was supposed to be resting and recovering from my memory issues. Cameron immediately placed a firm, controlling hand over hers, squeezing her fingers tight to silence her. He turned to her with a sickly sweet smile dripping with venomous manipulation. He told his beautiful wife that her father was deeply confused and that he was just stepping in to protect the family assets from being lost to my declining mental state. He whispered to her that this was an act of love and that she just needed to sit quietly while the adults handled the complicated legal burdens. I watched him gaslight my brilliant, innocent daughter right in front of my face. The absolute cruelty of his manipulation made the blood roar in my ears. He was using her profound love and concern for me as a weapon to silence her. I looked down at the contracts resting in front of me. The bold black letters demanded the complete surrender of my life's work. Cameron leaned across the mahogany wood until his face was just inches from mine. He kept his voice incredibly low, so Natalie could not hear the venom dripping from his lips. He whispered that I had exactly 60 seconds to pick up the pen. He reminded me of the forged embezzlement evidence he had planted on Natalie's work computer. He promised me that if I hesitated, he would send the email to the district attorney right now from his phone under the table. He smiled, showing his teeth, and told me he would watch my daughter go to federal prison without losing a single night of sleep. I picked up the sleek black pen Valerie had provided. I held it between my fingers, letting my hand tremble slightly, maintaining the illusion of a defeated, broken man for just a few agonizing seconds longer. Cameron leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me to sign them and ordered me not to make a pathetic scene in front of my daughter. He was so incredibly arrogant, so utterly blinded by his own greed, that he did not even realize the temperature in the room had fundamentally changed. I stopped trembling. My spine straightened. I looked directly into Cameron's cold, empty eyes. I did not say a single word. I simply placed the sleek black pen down on the mahogany table with a quiet, definitive tap. Cameron frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vicious whisper. He demanded to know what I was doing, telling me to pick up the pen and sign the papers immediately. Valerie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing the sudden shift in my demeanor. She glanced at the door, her predatory instincts warning her that something was terribly wrong. I reached my right hand slowly into the inner pocket of my faded cardigan. Cameron tensed slightly, perhaps thinking I was reaching for my reading glasses or a handkerchief to wipe away tears of defeat. Instead, I pulled out a small black plastic remote control. I held it up so the polished ambient light of the dining room caught its smooth surface. I pressed the top button with my thumb. A heavy electronic mechanism echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. The thick steel deadbolts inside the solid mahogany doors engaged with a loud resounding metallic thud. The private dining room was instantly sealed, locking us inside an impenetrable, soundproof vault. No one was coming in and absolutely no one was getting out. Cameron shot up out of his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the carpeted floor. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He slammed his hands onto the table, demanding to know what kind of sick game I was playing. He shouted that I was a crazy, senile old fool and that he was going to destroy me and my daughter right now. Valerie stood up, grabbing her tablet, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked doors. Natalie shrank back in her seat, completely terrified by the sudden, violent explosion of her husband's temper. She begged Cameron to calm down, begging me to explain what was happening. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at his aggressive posturing. I looked at my beautiful, terrified daughter and told her in a steady, calming voice that everything was going to be all right, but that she needed to watch the screen very carefully. I turned my gaze back to the monster standing across the table. I told Cameron that the game was officially over. I pressed the second button on the small black remote. Behind Cameron on the far wall, the massive high-definition television screen flickered to life. The sudden bright glow bathed the dark mahogany room in a stark, uncompromising light. Cameron spun around to face the screen, expecting to see a blank display or a meaningless corporate logo. He expected to see the erratic mistake of a confused old man. Instead, the screen illuminated a massive, crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph. It was not a presentation. It was a perfectly captured moment in time from exactly 1 month ago. The image showed the dark-shadowed corner of the elegant wedding reception hall. In the foreground, the bright, joyful blur of Natalie dancing in her beautiful white gown was visible. But the focus of the massive image was razor-sharp on the two figures standing in the shadows by the service exit. It was Cameron, looking incredibly smug, handing a thick manila envelope and a silver flash drive to a woman dressed in a crisp black and white catering uniform. The ultra-high-definition zoom captured every single damning detail. The woman reaching for the stolen digital drive was not an anonymous hospitality worker. It was the exact same woman sitting at the dining table pretending to be a corporate wealth manager. It was Valerie. And slipping clearly out of the unsealed flap of the manila envelope, perfectly illuminated by the rogue flash of a camera, was the bold printed title of my private corporate documents. Irrevocable Transfer of Assets, Russell Properties, LLC. The silence in the locked dining room was absolute. It was a suffocating heavy vacuum that pulled the breath directly from their lungs. Cameron stood frozen, staring up at the massive glowing screen as if he were looking at a ghost. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. Valerie dropped her digital tablet onto the table, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Her disguise was completely shattered. her criminal identity fully exposed in 40,000 pixels of undeniable proof. Natalie slowly stood up from her chair. Her eyes tracked from the massive screen down to the woman sitting across the table, and then finally rested on the man she had just married. The profound, innocent confusion in her eyes was rapidly dissolving, replaced by the horrifying dawning realization of a massive, unthinkably cruel betrayal. The trap was perfectly sprung. The invisible war had just been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the blinding light. Cameron let out a breathless, forced chuckle that echoed sharply against the acoustic paneling of the private dining room. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and turned his back to the massive television screen. He looked down at Natalie with an expression of manufactured pity. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, leaning in close. He spoke in that same slow, soothing voice he used when trying to convince the world I was losing my mind. He told her not to look at the screen. He whispered that I was deeply unwell, that my dementia was causing me to hallucinate wild conspiracy theories. He claimed the photograph was nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. He lied with the breathtaking ease of a seasoned sociopath, insisting that he was merely handing a generous cash tip to the catering manager to ensure the reception ran smoothly. He swore that my fading, diseased mind had completely fabricated the rest, distorting a kind gesture into a paranoid delusion. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes wide and swimming with unshed tears. She desperately wanted to believe the man she loved. She wanted the nightmare to end. But she slowly turned her head, pulling away from his touch, and looked back at the glowing screen. The high-definition image was unforgiving. The bold black letters spelling out irrevocable transfer of assets were too clear, too specific, to be dismissed as a simple envelope of cash. She looked at Valerie, who was sitting frozen across the mahogany table, and then she looked at me. The profound confusion in her eyes begged me to make the horror stop, to tell her it was all a terrible mistake. I did not offer a single word of argument. I did not engage in a shouting match with a cornered thief. I maintained absolute eye contact with Cameron, letting him see the cold, unyielding certainty in my gaze. I simply pressed the right directional arrow on the small plastic remote hidden in the palm of my hand. The image of the wedding reception vanished from the massive television screen. In its place, a scanned, officially notarized government document illuminated the dark dining room. It was not a blurry photograph or a questionable piece of circumstantial evidence. It was a certified state record bearing the official embossed seal of the county clerk. Natalie stared at the screen, her breath catching audibly in her throat. The bold text at the top of the document read, "Certificate of Marriage." She read the names printed in the center of the page. The groom was listed clearly as Cameron. The bride was listed as Valerie Vance. Natalie's eyes darted to the date stamped at the bottom of the certificate. It had been officially filed and executed exactly 4 years prior. And according to the glowing digital red stamp my forensic accountant had superimposed over the corner of the image, the marriage was fully active and legally binding. The absolute silence in the room was heavier than concrete. The irrefutable truth hung over the mahogany table, casting a sickening light on the entire charade. The beautiful wedding ceremony I had paid for the vows, Cameron had whispered to my daughter at the altar. The future they had promised to build together every single moment was a calculated, legally void sham. My daughter was not a wife. She was the unwitting victim of an elaborate, devastating, long con. Valerie was the first to break. The sophisticated, composed facade of the high-level wealth manager completely evaporated. She dropped her digital tablet onto the table with a loud clatter. Panic, raw and unfiltered, contorted her sharp features. She realized she was locked in a room with a man who knew her true identity and possessed the exact documentation needed to send her to a federal penitentiary. She jumped out of her leather chair, her heels scraping frantically against the carpet. She abandoned her expensive handbag on the table and lunged for the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the dining room. She grabbed the ornate brass handles, yanking them downward with all her body weight. The heavy steel deadbolts did not even rattle. The electronic lock I had engaged held the doors completely immovable. Valerie beat her palms against the thick wood, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She spun around her back, pressed against the door, looking at Cameron with wild, accusing eyes. The sophisticated criminal operation had collapsed, leaving behind a terrified accomplice trapped in a soundproof vault. All the color drained from Natalie's face. Her skin turned a ghostly, translucent pale. She looked at the marriage certificate glowing on the wall, and then she looked at Cameron. Her entire body began to tremble. The man standing next to her was a complete stranger. The life she thought she was living was a meticulously constructed prison designed to strip her bare. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She simply stared at him, the profound devastation of the betrayal silently tearing her heart to pieces. Cameron stared at the screen, the muscles in his jaw twitching violently. He realized the gaslighting was no longer an option. The kindly, forgetful husband routine was utterly useless against certified government records. He realized that I had not only discovered his plot, but I had documented every single facet of his criminal enterprise. The trap had closed and he was standing directly in the center of the teeth. When Cameron turned his gaze away from the screen and looked down at my weeping daughter, the handsome, charming young executive completely vanished. The mask fell away entirely, revealing a creature of pure, unadulterated malice. He did not apologize. He did not ask for forgiveness. The desperate panic in his eyes hardened into a vicious, cornered cruelty. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through Natalie's quiet sobs. He looked at her with absolute disgust, completely dropping the loving partner persona. He told her to stop crying like a pathetic child. He mocked her pure, trusting nature, calling her blindingly naive for believing that a man like him would ever actually fall in love with a woman so ordinary. He boasted that manipulating her had been the easiest job of his life, claiming she was so desperate for affection that she had practically handed him the keys to the vault without asking a single question. Natalie recoiled, pressing herself against the back of her chair, as if trying to physically escape the venom pouring from his mouth. But Cameron was not finished. He leaned over the table, bracing his hands on the polished wood, and unleashed his final, most devastating weapon. He told her that her tears were entirely useless because the damage was already done. He smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and declared that he had already systematically drained her personal checking and savings accounts over the past 3 weeks. He bragged that her money was already scattered across untraceable offshore routing numbers. But the theft of her personal savings was only the beginning. Cameron's eyes gleamed with a dark, sociopathic delight as he explained the true depth of the snare he had built around her. He told Natalie that she was legally tied to his fraudulent shadow holding company. He explicitly detailed how he had used her private social security number and her forged digital signatures to co-sign the creation of the illicit entity. He explained that every stolen dollar, every forged transfer, and every piece of fraudulent commercial real estate paperwork was legally bound to her identity. He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket with a chilling, arrogant calmness. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a daring, defiant challenge. He boasted that he had built the perfect human shield. He declared that if I even thought about calling the police, handing over the flash drive, or taking him to court, the federal authorities would immediately arrest Natalie alongside him. He promised me that the state prosecutors would view her as a willing, active co-conspirator in the massive embezzlement of her own father's estate. Cameron pointed a threatening finger at my daughter, his voice echoing loudly in the sealed room. He swore that if he was going down, he was going to drag her straight into the abyss with him. He promised that they would both share a federal prison cell and that he would spend every day of his trial ensuring the media painted her as a greedy, manipulative daughter who tried to rob her own sick father. He was holding her future hostage, betting everything on the absolute certainty that a father's love would force me to unlock the doors and let him walk away with my fortune. He believed his threat of mutually assured destruction was the ultimate trump card. He was entirely unaware that I had already severed the fuse. Cameron stood tall at the edge of the mahogany table, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own vicious monologue. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute unshakable certainty. He believed he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He extended his hand, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the locked electronic doors at the back of the private dining room. He told me I had exactly 10 seconds to pick up my remote control, disengage the steel deadbolts, and let him and Valerie walk out of the restaurant without a single word of protest. He demanded that I let them keep the cash they had already siphoned from my daughter's personal accounts, framing it as a small severance package for his wasted time. He leaned forward, resting his palms flat against the polished wood, and warned me that if I called the police or attempted to stop them, he would instantly execute his backup plan. He promised to send the fabricated evidence of embezzlement directly to the federal authorities, ensuring that Natalie would be arrested before the sun came up. My daughter sat completely paralyzed in her chair. The devastating weight of her husband's cruelty had crushed the breath right out of her lungs. She looked at the man she had promised to spend her life with, finally seeing the cold reptilian monster hiding beneath the tailored suit. She was silently weeping, the tears spilling down her pale cheeks, entirely convinced that her life was completely over. She believed she was trapped in an inescapable nightmare, bound legally and financially to a criminal who was actively preparing to throw her to the wolves. She looked at me with eyes full of profound, heartbreaking apology, silently begging me to open the doors and give him whatever he wanted, just to make the terror stop. Cameron smiled at her tears. He actually smiled. He turned his attention back to me, raising his eyebrows in a silent, arrogant demand. He asked me if I was going to be a smart father and unlock the door, or if I was going to be a stubborn old fool and watch my only child go to prison. I did not reach for the door control. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not surrender. I looked at the smug, victorious expression painted across his face, and I felt a deep, resonant calm settle over my entire body. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded cardigan, but I did not pull out the black plastic remote. Instead, I pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen a few times, navigating through the menus with steady, deliberate precision. I connected the device to the private dining room's integrated Bluetooth surround sound system. The speakers mounted in the corners of the ceiling emitted a soft, quiet chime, indicating a successful pairing. Cameron frowned, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. He asked me what I was doing, demanding that I stop playing games and open the doors immediately. I ignored his commands. I simply pressed the play button on my screen and placed the phone gently on the table. The sudden sharp sound of shattering glass echoed violently through the high-quality overhead speakers. It was the exact sound of my water cup breaking against the kitchen tiles from a few nights ago. Then a voice boomed into the dining room. It was Cameron's voice, captured with pristine, undeniable clarity. The audio filled the sealed space, loud and terrifying. The recording played the exact moment he had kicked in my back door and violently cornered me against my kitchen counter. Valerie stepped back from the doors, her eyes widening in absolute horror. Natalie gasped, recognizing the vicious, venomous tone of the man she had married. The recording captured Cameron hissing his threats, completely unhinged and desperate. His voice echoed from the ceiling, detailing his entire extortion plot with sickening precision. We sat in the dining room and listened as the recorded version of Cameron explicitly bragged about routing fraudulent commercial transactions directly through Natalie's personal work computer. We heard him boast about intentionally using her private digital signatures to authorize the transfer of stolen corporate funds. We heard him explicitly state that he had created a flawless paper trail designed to frame his own wife as the sole mastermind of a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. The audio continued to play, capturing his cruel laughter and his promises to watch my daughter go to federal prison without losing a single night of sleep. He had laid out his entire criminal strategy, thoroughly implicating himself in felony extortion, severe elder abuse, and the deliberate fabrication of federal evidence. The recording captured his demands for a multi-million-dollar wire transfer, leaving absolutely no room for interpretation or plausible deniability. When the audio finally clicked to an end, the silence that fell over the mahogany table was completely suffocating. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the devastating reality of his undeniable guilt. Valerie stared at Cameron with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She realized that his arrogant, sloppy behavior had just provided the authorities with a neatly wrapped, irrefutable confession. His ego had destroyed their entire operation. Cameron stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his mind violently struggling to process the catastrophic collapse of his leverage. He stammered, pointing a shaking finger at my phone, claiming that the recording was completely illegal and inadmissible in a court of law. He tried to project confidence, but his voice was thin and reedy. He insisted that his threat was still valid, claiming that the fabricated evidence on Natalie's computer was still a loaded weapon he could use against her. I shook my head slowly, looking at him with absolute clinical detachment. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather briefcase I had brought with me. I unbuckled the straps and pulled out a thick, bound forensic dossier. I dropped the heavy file onto the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, definitive thud that made both Cameron and Valerie jump. I told Cameron that he was operating under the foolish assumption that he was the only man in the city who knew how to utilize the legal system. I explained that while he was busy bullying an old man in a kitchen, I had deployed one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state, alongside a brilliant forensic accountant. I pushed the heavy dossier across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of his trembling hands. I instructed him to read the documents. I explained that my team had completely bypassed his amateur digital safeguards. They had accessed the state commercial registry and legally petitioned the oversight board with undeniable proof of severe identity theft. They had traced every single fraudulent digital signature and systematically dismantled the illusion he had built around my daughter. I spoke with the cold, measured authority of a commercial developer who had spent decades destroying corporate predators. I told him that Natalie's name had been completely scrubbed and expunged from the Shadow Limited Liability Company. She was officially and legally severed from his entire criminal enterprise. The fabricated paper trail he had left on her work computer had been forensically isolated, completely discredited, and handed directly to the state prosecutors as evidence of his malicious tampering. I looked into his panicked, wide eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that he had absolutely no leverage left. His human shield had been completely removed from the battlefield. Cameron stared at the heavy legal dossier, the reality of his absolute defeat crashing down on him like a collapsing building. He was no longer a powerful, untouchable executive holding the keys to my kingdom. He was just a pathetic, cornered criminal trapped in a locked room. He had no money, no leverage, and no escape route. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for bigamy, wire fraud, felony extortion, forgery, and elder abuse, and he had personally provided the prosecution with a crystal-clear audio confession. The realization broke his mind completely. The sophisticated, charming mask shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving nothing behind but raw, animalistic desperation. He let out a visceral, guttural scream of pure rage. He swept his arm across the table violently, knocking the heavy crystal wine glasses and the silver cutlery onto the floor. The sound of shattering glass filled the room. His eyes were wild, fully dilated with panic and unhinged fury. He planted his hands firmly on the polished wood and lunged his entire body across the massive mahogany table, launching himself directly toward my throat. Cameron launched his entire body across the wide expanse of the mahogany table like a desperate, cornered animal. His tailored suit jacket snagged on the edge of a silver serving tray, sending porcelain plates and crystal water pitchers crashing to the carpeted floor. He did not care about the noise or the mess. His entire focus was consumed by the leather briefcase and the smartphone resting near my hands. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, completely stripped of any human rationality. He was operating on pure primal panic. He wanted to seize the audio recording. He wanted to shred the forensic dossier that proved his ultimate failure. He extended his arms with his fingers hooked into claws, aiming directly for my throat. I saw the absolute intent to do grave bodily harm written clearly across his face. He was no longer trying to steal my wealth through legal loopholes. He was attempting to silence me through blunt physical violence. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect my face or shrink back into my chair. I simply watched him fly across the polished wood, observing his rapid descent into total madness, with the calm, detached precision of a man who had already calculated the exact trajectory of his fall. I knew he would resort to violence the moment his intelligence failed him. Men who rely on deception always turn to brute force when their lies evaporate in the light. Natalie let out a piercing, terrified scream, pushing her chair back so violently it toppled over onto the carpet. Valerie pressed her back flush against the wall, covering her mouth, and watching her entire criminal enterprise collapse in real time. Cameron was mere inches away from me. I could feel the disturbed air rushing ahead of his grasping hands and smell the stale sweat of his profound terror. With a slow, deliberate movement, my thumb depressed the final raised button on the small black remote control resting securely in my palm. A sharp, loud metallic click echoed through the dining room. It was the heavy, definitive sound of the electronic deadbolts sliding backward and disengaging completely from the reinforced doorframes. The impenetrable seal I had placed over the room was instantly broken. The massive mahogany doors did not just open. They swung outward with tremendous imposing force. The bright light from the main restaurant corridor flooded into our dark, tense arena. Standing directly in the center of the threshold was Fletcher. My ruthless corporate litigator looked absolutely immaculate in his bespoke suit, with his hands resting calmly on his silver-handled cane. He did not look surprised by the chaotic scene inside. He looked like a man arriving exactly on time for a scheduled demolition. Flanking Fletcher on both sides was a formidable wall of law enforcement. 3 federal agents stood in the hallway, their faces set in grim, uncompromising expressions. Beside them stood Sergeant O'Connell from the local precinct, a man I had known for 20 years. The federal agents moved into the room with swift, terrifying efficiency. They did not shout orders or hesitate for a fraction of a second. They crossed the room immediately, bypassing the spilled wine and broken glass. One agent grabbed Cameron by the collar of his expensive suit, halting his violent lunge toward me in midair. The agent effortlessly twisted Cameron's arm behind his back and slammed his chest hard against the surface of the mahogany table. The unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Cameron's wrists filled the air. Cameron let out a breathless, pathetic gasp as the cold metal locked his hands together behind his back. A second agent moved directly toward Valerie. The moment the agent reached for her, the sophisticated, high-level wealth manager persona completely disintegrated. Valerie began to scream loudly. It was not a scream of fear, but a high-pitched, desperate shriek of self-preservation. She pointed a shaking finger at Cameron, her voice echoing wildly off the soundproof walls. She shrieked that she had absolutely nothing to do with the embezzlement or the forged corporate documents. She yelled that Cameron was a manipulative monster who had forced her into participating in the scheme. She threw her own husband completely to the wolves, claiming he had threatened to ruin her life if she did not put on the catering uniform and collect the stolen drives. She wept hysterically, begging the federal agents to look at her as an innocent victim of his aggressive coercion. Cameron lifted his head from the polished wood, his face red and contorted with profound humiliation. He ignored Valerie's frantic betrayal and desperately tried to salvage his own shattered image. He looked frantically at Sergeant O'Connell, his voice stammering and remarkably weak. He claimed this was all a massive, illegal corporate setup. He lied through his teeth, stating that I was a ruthless, vindictive billionaire who had orchestrated an elaborate frame job to destroy a poor, innocent marketing executive. He swore that the audio recording was a digitally altered fabrication, and that the forensic dossier was entirely falsified by my highly paid lawyers. He pleaded with the officers, trying to convince them that he was the real victim of a malicious personal vendetta. The federal agents did not entertain a single second of their frantic, desperate lies. They already possessed the flash drive with the digital blueprints of the Shadow Company. They had already reviewed the clear audio confession of felony extortion. They had already verified the certified marriage certificate proving the bigamy. The lead agent pulled Cameron upward, forcing him to stand on his own 2 feet. The agent looked Cameron dead in the eyes and began to recite his Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice. The agent informed Cameron that he had the right to remain silent, a right he should have exercised long before he walked into my kitchen to threaten my daughter. Another agent secured handcuffs around Valerie's wrists, reading her the exact same rights as she continued to sob and curse Cameron's name. Fletcher stepped aside, clearing the doorway for the authorities. The agents gripped Cameron and Valerie firmly by their arms and began the long march out of the private dining room. This was the final, inescapable consequence I had meticulously planned from the very beginning. They were not being quietly escorted out of a back service exit to save them from public embarrassment. They were being dragged directly through the main floor of the most exclusive, high-end restaurant in the entire city. I followed slowly behind them, walking alongside Fletcher and Sergeant O'Connell. We stepped out of the private room and into the bustling, brightly lit main dining area. The sudden appearance of federal agents and local police dragging a struggling handcuffed couple instantly silenced the entire restaurant. Dozens of wealthy patrons, local politicians, and prominent corporate executives stopped eating. Forks hovered in mid-air and conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone turned to stare at the incredible unfolding spectacle. Cameron tried to lower his head to hide his face from the crowd, but the agent held him firmly upright. The arrogant young executive who had prided himself on his impeccable public image was now being paraded like a common thief. People at the tables began to whisper, pointing at the disgraced couple. I saw a few patrons raise their smartphones to record the scene digitally, cementing his absolute downfall for the world to see. Every single business contact and social connection he had spent years cultivating would know the absolute truth before the night was over. His reputation was reduced to ashes in a matter of seconds. Valerie continued to weep loudly, her designer clothes wrinkled and her dignity entirely stripped away by her own greed. They were marched past the grand piano, past the crystal chandeliers, and straight out the heavy glass front doors of the establishment. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked on the street illuminated the dark, rainy night. The federal agents pushed Cameron and Valerie into the back of separate vehicles, ensuring they could not coordinate their lies any further. I stood under the awning of the restaurant, watching the cruisers speed away into the city. The illusion Cameron had built was completely demolished, and the arrogant predator was finally locked inside a cage he could never manipulate his way out of. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles faded into the cold, rainy night, leaving a profound stillness in their wake. I turned away from the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant and walked slowly back through the main dining area. The patrons had returned to their meals, their hushed whispers following me down the corridor, but I paid them no mind. My only concern was the young woman sitting alone in the private dining room. When I crossed the threshold, the heavy mahogany doors remained open, completely shattering the suffocating tension of the trap I had built. The room was no longer a sealed arena for corporate execution. It was just a quiet space filled with spilled wine, shattered crystal, and the scattered, meaningless pages of fraudulent contracts. Natalie was still sitting in her chair, looking incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive dark television screen. She was trembling violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist, as if she were desperately trying to hold her shattered heart together. I walked over to her, but I did not shuffle my feet. My spine remained perfectly straight, and my hands were entirely steady. The fragile, forgetful old widower was completely gone. The strong, uncompromising father she truly needed was finally standing in front of her. I pulled a heavy leather chair close to hers and sat down, reaching out to gently take her cold, shaking hands in mine. The moment my fingers closed around hers, the shock finally broke. Natalie collapsed against my chest, burying her face in my shoulder, and let out a broken, agonizing sob that tore at my soul. She cried for the husband she thought she knew. She cried for the beautiful future she thought she was building. And she cried for the profound, terrifying betrayal she had just been forced to witness. I held her tightly, resting my chin against the top of her head, letting her pour out every ounce of humiliation and pain. I did not offer empty platitudes. I did not tell her to stop crying or that everything happened for a reason. I simply held her acting as an unmovable anchor in the center of her collapsing world, silently promising her that the absolute worst part of her life was officially over. When her tears finally slowed to quiet, exhausted hiccups, she pulled back slightly and looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, searching my face for answers that made sense of the chaos. She asked me in a raspy whisper how I had known the truth, how I had managed to orchestrate such a massive, flawless takedown, and most importantly, why I had never told her the reality about my life. I kept my hands firmly over hers and told her absolutely everything. I did not hide a single detail or soften the truth. I explained that for 40 years, long before my supposed quiet retirement, I had built and managed a massive commercial real estate empire alongside her late mother. I told her about the multi-million-dollar property portfolio, the offshore trusts, and the blind holding companies I had established decades ago. Natalie listened in stunned silence as I explained my reasons for living such a fiercely invisible life. I told her that immense wealth acts as a blinding beacon for the absolute worst kinds of predators in the world. Her mother and I had made a conscious decision to raise her in a modest suburban environment because we wanted her to grow up valuing hard work, genuine relationships, and personal integrity over a massive unearned trust fund. I wanted her to be loved for the brilliant, compassionate woman she was, not targeted for the bank accounts she was tied to. I confessed that my greatest fear had always been a man exactly like Cameron infiltrating our lives, a smooth-talking parasite who would use her pure, trusting heart as a stepping stone to steal our family legacy. I apologized to her, my voice thick with genuine sorrow, for the immense pain my deception had ultimately caused her tonight. I told her I was so incredibly sorry she had to endure the trauma of this brutal betrayal, but I swore to her that my absolute dedication had always been to her safety. I promised her that I would gladly burn the entire world down before I ever let anyone treat her as a disposable stepping stone. I told her that her trusting nature was a beautiful gift, and that Cameron's betrayal was a reflection of his own dark sociopathy, not a failure on her part. Natalie looked at the scattered forged documents on the table, and then she looked back at me. She did not yell or accuse me of lying. She saw the fierce, uncompromising love in my eyes, and she understood that every single decision I had made, including the elaborate charade of my own vulnerability, had been executed entirely to save her life. 6 months passed since that devastating night in the private dining room. The storm that had threatened to completely destroy our family had finally passed, leaving behind a profound, unshakable peace. The legal fallout from the restaurant ambush was swift, absolute, and utterly merciless. Facing a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, including the digital blueprints of the shadow company, the certified bigamy documents, the illegal appraisal records, and the explicit audio confession of felony extortion, Cameron and Valerie completely surrendered. They realized that taking the case to a federal trial would result in an absolute massacre by my legal team. To avoid a guaranteed 30-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary, they both accepted a harsh, uncompromising plea deal. They were currently serving lengthy federal sentences, their arrogant illusions of immense wealth and power entirely replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of a prison cell. They had tried to steal an empire, and it had rightfully cost them the rest of their natural lives. More importantly, Natalie's fraudulent marriage to Cameron was swiftly and legally annulled. The court recognized the union as a criminal sham from its very inception, completely erasing his poisonous name from her history. The trauma of the betrayal had been profound, but my daughter proved to be incredibly resilient. She did not let the cruelty of a predator break her spirit or make her cynical. Instead, she channeled her pain into a fierce, commanding strength. She was no longer an oblivious young woman targeted by con artists. She had stepped out of the shadows and taken an active leading role in managing Russell Properties. She spent her days learning the intricate details of the commercial real estate empire I had built, inheriting my sharp corporate instincts while retaining her own deep empathy. We spent our weeks working side by side in the executive offices, replacing the terrible memories of the past with a powerful unified vision for our family's future. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat on the wooden porch of my modest suburban home enjoying a hot cup of black coffee. The air was crisp and the neighborhood was perfectly still. I did not need to wear faded sweaters or pretend my hands were shaking anymore. I was simply a father enjoying the morning light. I turned my head and looked through the living room window at the wall above the fireplace. The large, expensive wedding photograph that used to hang there showcasing a fraudulent, smiling groom had been completely thrown away. In its place hung a simple, framed, candid shot taken years ago. It showed Natalie and me standing in the aisle of a local hardware store, laughing uncontrollably over a spilled bucket of nails. It was a picture of genuine, unpretentious love. It was the absolute truth. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, resonant calm settle over my entire property. The silent shift was completely finished. The predators had been locked away. The fortress was secure. Order was finally restored. If this story has moved you or made you reflect on your own relationships, please share your thoughts in the comments below.